My name is James Riley, the Wisconsin Historical Fencing Association.
And I'm Adam Ogle.
Today we're going to talk to you about the Krumphau and the associated place for the Krumphau found in Liechtenauer Zell. So the Zell teaches us how to defend against an opponent's overhand, and it also gives us particular what Liechtenauer calls hidden strikes, which are ways to attack an opponent standing in a particular posture. But he also gives us an alternative way to defend against an opponent's overhau or unterhau, and he does so in the manner of the Krumphau. If my opponent is standing in an edge threatening guard, Vamtag is a great example, then I can expect that he's going to attack with some sort of cut above or below. In this case, I'm likewise standing in an edge threatening guard from above on my strong side, as Liechtenauer would have us, as is Liechtenauer's preferred way of us entering into measure. As my opponent strikes in with an overhau, I'm going to step offline and I'm going to execute a strike with the long edge across his wrist. Now what's important here is that when my opponent does this, that I don't just remain there. Typically when we think about these drills, we think about them in a static way, meaning my opponent throws a cut against a target. As I step offline, that target's no longer there, and he continues his attack against that target as though I hadn't moved. What we need to do instead is we need to, after we execute this counter, after we strike at our opponent's wrists or forearms, that we immediately take control of the center back from our opponent, and we're going to do that by extending our sword overhead. So as he throws his overhau, I'm going to extend, stepping outside, striking just as far as I can away from his hands, and then immediately returning with my long edge over his sword to cover that line. One last time. Likewise, we can do this with unterhau. If my opponent is threatening with a cut from below, or even if he's standing in Vamtag, he can still throw an unterhau from Vamtag. He throws his unterhau, target the wrists, and then extend my sword back over his to ensure that that I cover his line. Again, we're not static, we're dynamic. As I step offline, he's already adjusting his cut with relatively low latency. So I need to immediately counter or immediately cover the exposed line. Now, Liechtenauer also uses the Krump, not as just an attack to the hand, but also as an attack to the blade. If my opponent strikes an overhau, what Liechtenauer is going to suggest that we do is we're going to crump to the flat, and what we're going to achieve here is weakening him. So as he strikes, now I'm in a situation where I can either strike with the short edge or with the point. And after we've weakened him, Liechtenauer says, attack in the ways that I've discussed before. It's our speculation that he's referring back to those techniques that are applicable against an opponent who's weak in the parry. So as I crump to the flat to weaken him, he goes weak in the parry, and I immediately turn in with the Tieren or the handy truck in, whatever's applicable. So Liechtenauer describes the Krumphau as a method of countering an overhau or an unterhau. He also uses the Krumphau as an effective counter against an opponent who's entering into measure in left ochs. So again, we're starting from an edge threatening guard from above on the right, our strong side. Our opponent enters into measure in left ochs. What he's done here is he's created a much smaller target area for his attack, whereas when he was cutting, he had a huge swath that fell within his effective range. When he threatens with the point, he makes his target area further back, so he has more measure to work with, but a smaller space where he can put that attack. And so what I can do is I can use the Krumphau, stepping offline, removing myself from that threat, and targeting the hands. Now he can track my movement with his point, but in that moment, if he keeps his point on me, what he's doing is he's creating a weak structure that I can exploit. So if I strike the Krumphau and he brings his point, he keeps his point on line, well then here I can attack with the same tools that Liechtenauer has given us when in the Zornhaus section when he's talked about me turning hand tricking. So one more time, as I strike the Krump, if he's weak on the parry, then I can be cheering. Or if I strike against my opponent when he's in left ochs with a right Krumphau, and he's strong on the parry, he's creating an angle on my sword that makes it so that the force of my Krumphau is channeled into his cross, then immediately as I see that, I can rush in, turning my short edge into his hands, slicing to control his arms, and then moving back out of measure. One more time. I come to the hands to get the strong angle. I drive in with the short edge, pushing his hands up. Now, up until this point, Liechtenauer suggested that the way that we enter into range is from a strong guard, meaning on our dominant side, from above, threatening with the edge. Liechtenauer is now going to introduce a second posture from which he's saying that it's preferred to attack. And that's going to be the posture of Schnitt, which is going to be a guard similar to Albert, but where the point is horizontal as opposed to in front of us in some way. And we're going to orient our long edge towards our opponent with our thumb on the flat. So here, we can use this to drive the Krumphau against all of the things that Liechtenauer said that the Krumphau is effective against. That's everything from a cut from above, strike to the hands, or a cut from below, strike to the hands again, or against an opponent in left ochs, to the hands, or we can strike onto the blade if it's weak, we can be cheering, or we can strike onto the blade. He goes strong, and then we schnitt. But what Liechtenauer also says is that we can use the Schrankhook to drive the Krump from both sides. And so now we have an option against an opponent who goes up into right ochs. So from here, I turn my long edge into my opponent, and I strike a Krump to the hands, or a Krump to the blade if he's weak. Even if he tries to defend, so right now he's being static, but if he tries to defend in a strong way, I drive the short edge and schnitt. Or if he tries to defend in a weak way, I can do tieren, or if he's pushed my point offline, I can hand truck him. Now, Liechtenauer also describes crumping short. Up until this point, we've talked about being strong in the bind, having a strong angle on our opponent's sword, or having our sword in line with our skeletal structure. And we've thought about it in terms of having the overbind. But it's possible to be strong in the bind against an opponent who's on top of our sword. And what Liechtenauer is going to do here is he's going to show us how that's possible. If my opponent strikes a cut at me, I'm going to crump, but I'm going to crump under his blade. What this is going to do, if I've lined my sword up with my skeletal structure, pointing down the angle of his cut, it's going to force his cut into the strong of my blade, collecting the force of it on the cross. From here, I can cut up, put my point on the line, and thrust in. One more time, my opponent strikes in at me. I Kurtzhau, or Krump short, cut up, and thrust in. And he also shows us how this technique can be used against an opponent in left ochs again. So if my opponent is in left ochs, I can Krump. We've already seen how the Krump works against an opponent in left ochs. We're striking the hands to draw the parry. As I Krump, he brings his sword up, and from here I'm going to Der Schwechseln under his sword, effectively Krumping short, and then driving the point in underneath. If my opponent decides to attempt to parry my Kurtzhau against left ochs, I strike against his hands, he lifts his sword, I bring my sword underneath, I drive it forward. As he pushes my sword offline in a strong way, then I'm going to thrust in. So again, I'm going to Krump, bring his sword up, driving underneath. Immediately as he sees it, he's going to begin to drive strong against my Krump, and then in that moment, I'm going to thrust, and it's sort of a declare action. Now, one last thing that Liechtenauer offers us here is a counter against the Krumphau. If I am entering into measure with an edge threatening guard, my opponent sees that, expects a cut from above or below, and decides to Krump against the flat. As I throw my cut, he Krumps, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my sword to remain strong on that cut, to drive the force of that Krumphau into my cross, and then wind in to thrust underneath, thrusting him in the chest. One more time. I begin my overhau. He Krumps, I go strong, and then, as I've collected the force, drive my point in. So to recap, what we're doing with the Krumphau is we're stepping offline, removing ourselves from the threat area, so the best way that we can. We're entering into a bind in a situation that we can control depending on how our opponent reacts. We've got counters against our opponent if he parries in a strong way or in a weak way. And we've also learned, probably the most controversial part about this interpretation is going to be the idea that we can be strong in the bind and not have the overbind, as long as we're directing the force of the opponent's cut into the cross by pointing our sword down the angle of his cut and channeling the force into our skeletal structure. Thank you very much.